Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and welcome to your SimWorks Studios PC-12 tutorial. A lot of assumptions have been made about this airplane over the past couple of days since its release, and many of them are actually based on wrong assumptions about the real airplane. So stand by for this one, and I'm sure you're going to learn quite a bit. So the SimWorks Studios PC-12 is quite a comprehensive simulation, and it features a lot of the quirks of the airplane, like the interconnect between aileron and rudder, so you move one and the other moves automatically. And these kind of things are stuff that do happen to catch simmers out. I will try to address as many of them as possible in this tutorial as well. So you can see we're standing in a rainy Saint-Tropez at the moment, and we are going to make a quick half-an-hour flight over to Calvi, in which we are going to address how to operate the airplane correctly, and in which I'm going to give you a lot of insight into the operation of the PC-12. So, this tutorial is based on the checklist that's included with the add-on. You can also download it from the SimWorks Studios Discord. So I do recommend you to get that checklist to follow along on this tutorial and to follow along when I'm addressing some of the stuff that is mentioned in the checklist and how those things work. Alright, so let's open the Navigraph app to have a look at exactly where we are going to fly and what kind of procedures we are going to do today. As you can see, this is our route of flight. We are going to make a Sodre departure out of Saint-Tropez and then a Sodre arrival into Calvi. The SID itself is a rather simplistic one, straight at 1500, right-hand turn to Saint-Tropez, then onto Lerma. After that you would get radar vectors in the real world towards Oman, and then from there we are going to continue on to Sodre. Now, the arrival, then again, is also coming from Sodre. SimBrief has selected the Kilo arrival by default. We don't want to do that, however, we want to use the Lima arrival, as that basically is the version for the localizer approach that we are going to fly today. You may be wondering, why did I choose a localizer approach for this tutorial? Well, that's actually quite easy, because anybody can fly an ILS or an RNAV. You just hit the approach button and the airplane flies you down. A localizer, however, is a little bit more challenging, and since the PC-12 is an aircraft that you are going to fly into a lot of airports which do not necessarily have an approach system available, let me just call it like that, where you hit the approach button and the airplane flies you down, I want to give you a little bit of an insight into how to fly something like a localizer approach over here. Okay, so that is our general idea of what we're about to do. A quick look into the weather then. You can see over here in Saint-Tropez we are actually only getting weather from the nearest airport, which is 12 miles away, which got light wind coming from the northeast. 6,000 meters in rain, the cloud ceiling is not measurable, temperature 9 and QNH 1010. And that's the best data we've got available for our departure airport. Okay, so with that discussed, I do suppose we have a quick look into our flight plan. Do note at this moment there is a little problem of sim revealing the plan, but this is the important part over here. Flight level 130 plan for the cruise, Sodre departure, Sodre arrival. Alright, so we are refueled, we are all ready to go, so let's follow me inside of the PC-12. And the first thing we're going to do is a quick discussion of how to open and close the doors. Now, the door itself can be extended from the airplane and serves as stairs as well, as you can see down here. In order to close it, we're simply going to click the lower part of the door down here. That is going to pull it up. And once it's pulled up, we also need to close and lock the door up here, otherwise our pressurization is not going to work. Similarly, if you want to open it, be sure to open the latch first, make sure that the indicators are showing open, and then you can just push it down with the top of the steps up here. So that's the door operation in the PC-12. Now let's close it down like that. You can see our passengers are on board already, and then we can head into our cockpit. Now, first things first, you do see these screens on our windshield, and those can be removed simply by clicking on them. But just a quick moment here, I really appreciate how by default they used the sun visor to put the screens in place. Really nice. Okay, so let's get rid of those, and then we can take a seat on our cockpit. Also, we are going to remove the control lock by a click on the control lock itself, and that is also going to remove all your pitot covers, as you can see. So they're all gone from down here. Just to show you what these look like if we had it in place. We got the covers down here with the remove before flight dongles on them. So we are going to remove those to be able to operate the controls. And that is also going to remove the covers and the chocks. So look at that, chocks are gone as well now. Okay, perfect. So with that, let's start with a pre-flight checklist. The checklists in this airplane are of a read and do nature, so since general aviation pilots often are not as proficient on their aircraft as airline pilots, in terms of they just fly them less, for a GA pilot doing 200 or maybe 300 hours a year is a lot, while for an airline pilot we're talking 700-800 hours. So for that reason the checklists are designed as read and do checklists. Okay, we're going to start with a pre-flight checklist then. Landing gear handle down, down. Circuit breakers in, and do note these are all modeled, so just as an example over here, this is what it looks like when they're pulled. You see that little white area here, so make sure that all the circuit breakers are in, and make sure to check that not just on your own side, but also check it on the FO side. In case you're wondering, you can remove the FO with a click on the headrest, so that gives you an easy overview. The same goes, by the way, if you do want to fly from the right-hand seat. Like that, you could place your captain in the left-hand seat. This is an interesting thing to know, because when you're sitting in the captain seat and you see this, then basically you can remove it by clicking on the headrest, and that is going to remove your 3D pilot from the seat in question. So a little trick in the airplane that is certainly worth knowing. Today we do obviously want our lovely lady over here. Okay, so that's the circuit breakers in, battery switch off, located up here, battery 1 and battery 2, both are off, external power switch off, non-essential override switch auto, which is where it is, standby bus switch, if applicable, on. So you can see the standby bus basically turns on electricity for the plane for a couple of very basic systems, like our COM1 gets powered, in this case our GNS 530 unit, and we get a couple of basic units. So now we are going to switch the external lights and electrical systems as required. Basically, we're just going to turn on the nav lights and that's it. Okay, and now we can turn our standby bus off again. And you can see the reason we did this is because otherwise we don't have any feedback if the system is turned on or turned off. So that's the entire reason we put that standby bus switch on at this point. Okay, battery switch on. That's battery number 1 and battery number 2. We make sure the voltage is greater than 24, which we can see up here on both panels. Okay, non-essential bus switch to override. Let's switch that to override, and we can see that now the drain on the battery has become quite a bit greater, because a couple more systems, namely the engine instrument system, is going to come on as well. Okay, so also what we do now is to turn on all the external lights, because we want to check that they're all working. So that's all the lights on. Then we go out for a quick moment and just have a look over here. We've got our landing lights, we've got our taxi light, we've got the recognition lights on the outside over here. Then moving on a little bit, we've got the nav lights obviously, we got a strobe light, and then the beacon in this airplane is actually hidden on the top over here. And there is one more on the bottom of the airplane, just down here. Alright, and finally we check on the other side that the green position light and the strobe lights working on this side, and at night you would also check for the ice lights to be operative as well. Okay, so like that we can now return into the cockpit, and we are going to switch all of those lights off again with the exception of the nav light. Okay, so with that our lights are tested, and now we can return the non-essential override switch back to the auto position. Next up we test the fire switch. So push it and hold it, and now observe the engine fire indication is showing down here. And the warning is coming up. Okay, so, and then we can release the fire switch again. In the real world, these test switches up here are press and hold switches. However, SimWorks Studios have simulated them so that the first click presses it in, and holds it, and the second click is going to release it again. So be sure to release that switch after you tested it. Okay, from here we move on to the lamps test. So again, same logic, and we make sure that all the lights in the cockpit are actually operating. Okay. So then we move on to the boost pumps, on then auto, and we are going to test them both. So turn up your audio right now, and I'm going to start with the left boost pump, and then both, and then the right boost pump, and you can hear how they are operating and how the sound gives you a spatial idea of that both pumps are actually operating. So let's give it a go. Right, so fuel pumps are working. Next up we are going to test the ignition, on, then auto, electronic instrument system test. So that's what we got down here, and we're going to start with a test switch, make sure that all the LEDs are working, which as you can see they are. Okay, and once this is resetted, we're going to reset the fuel quantity, which we can do down here, fuel reset, and that's going to reset both the fuel used and the fuel quantity. So you will see by default it shows you 0, but once the system reset is carried out, you're actually going to get a fuel quantity indication as well. So this just takes a little while to get done, and I do have a feeling sometimes you need to push it twice, but then you're eventually going to get your indications. Okay, here we are. Fuel quantity 1205, and the indication is good over there as well. Alright, cool. From there we are going to move on to the oxygen pressure gauge, and that is hidden below the armrest down here, and we want a maximum of 1850 psi. So you can see right now we're a little bit below that, and that is perfectly fine. Passenger oxygen auto, that's what we got over here. So the left side of the switch is off, the middle side is auto, the right switch is on. And obviously, we're just going to go for the auto position. Okay then, from here, we are basically done with the checksum system that we need to do. So the next step on the checklist is battery switch off. And that's our battery switches off. Then we move on to the EFIS switches that we can find over here, and we make sure this is set into the norm position. And the AHRS 1 and 2 are both slaved. So number 1 is over here, number 2 is over here, both are slaved. Okay, next we are going to test the emergency power system by putting the EPS switch into the test position. Wait a couple seconds, it's now doing a check of the battery circuit, and when that is completed and the emergency power system is fine, then the green light is going to illuminate. Okay, so from here, next up we've got the cabin pressure switch in the auto or guarded position. That's what you'll find down here, and you can see it's auto and the guard is down. The trim interrupt switch is located down here, and that's the left one of the two, and again that's in norm and guarded, and the flap interrupt switch on the right side is again norm and guarded. From there on we move to the oxygen supply handle, that's the one over here, which is going to go on, and then we can set all the cockpit and cabin light switches as applicable, so just set them to whatever you prefer. The panel light switch on the left is what lights up all the lines in the background and stuff. Then you've got the cockpit lights, obviously dome light, just lights up the entire thing. The floodlights are the yellowish lights that you have in the front. Then you've got the cabin lighting down here as well. So that's the different lights you've got available. Next up, we are going to check the lavatory, if applicable. And to our airplane, it is applicable because we do actually have a lavatory. So you're going to move a little bit over here, as close to the door as possible. Then if you just click your door over here, this is going to unravel the lavatory. You can actually open it down here as well. Make sure you've got toilet paper on board, and yeah, we have come to a spot where in flight simulation we are checking for toilet paper in the lavatories. Okay, then we can close it again. And that's it. And finally, aircraft exterior pre-flight complete is the last point on the pre-flight checklist. However, it's rainy today, so we are going to command our first officer to do that, and we are not going to bother with it. Okay, that's the pre-flight checklist complete. So next up, we can go ahead with the before start checklist. And again, it's read and do, so everything we do, we are going to do straight out of the manual. So we start with control wheel lock remove, and that is removed already. Parking brake set, that's down here, and when it's in the horizontal position, the parking brake is set. That's the release, and that's the set. Okay, wheel chocks removed. Those are removed already, together with the control lock in the sim. Then fuel caps secure. That is basically going outside again and making sure that all the caps of the fuel tanks are secured. So you want to make sure that you cannot accidentally start losing fuel on the outside when you go flying and when negative pressure develops on top of the wing. Okay, crew seats and seatbelts adjusted and secure. So what we would do in the real world is to get down the armrests, because it is quite important that you got something to relax your arm on when you're handling those levers, especially when you go into turbulence. Now, for purpose of the simulation, I am going to leave the right captain seat armrest, that one, I'm going to leave it up because it allows us easier access to the pedestal. But in the real world, you take all of these down now. Also, what you can do is to adjust your pedals at that point. So there should be a click spot somewhere down here. Here it is. Like that, you can adjust your rudder pedals so that you can easily access them. Okay, all red electrical switches off. And as you can see, the electrical switches over here are all off. Okay, standby bus, if applicable, on. So standby bus is coming on. De-icing switch, inertial separator open. That's what we've got up here. Then we can move on to cooling and heating off. So those are located down here. Both are off. Then seatbelt and no smoking sign as required. We do have passengers on board, so we're going to turn them both on today. Okay, circuit breakers in. This one we have to check again, because something might have popped during our earlier system tests. And we just want to make sure again that there is nothing popped. Like, if you look at that, that's what it looks like. So, we basically observe we got no white circles on the circuit breaker panels. Okay, so, EPS switch, test armed. So that's the emergency power. Now, from test, where we had it earlier, battery test okay, we're now going to move it to arm. And note the emergency power system is coming on straight away, because we currently don't have electrical power applied to the airplane. So batteries are currently off and the generators. Okay, ECS switch, that's the environmental control system, is turned off. Then friction lock check. Now the friction lock is something that in the real world is rather important, because it is going to determine how much force you need in order to move the levers down here. In the simulation, well, basically it doesn't play a role, because obviously if you can adjust the friction on your joystick, like for example on the Honeycomb Bravo throttle, then by all means do adjust it, but inside the virtual cockpit you cannot do that. Then we move on to the manual override, power control and condition levers. Make sure they're all back, but with the power control lever make sure it's not in the reverse position. So basically make sure they are where they are right now. And with that, we can now turn on the batteries. So battery switch on, and that's obviously going to be both of them. Then nav lights on. They're on already from our earlier check. External power as required, so you can use external power if you want to. So if you just put the switch up, it's going to come on, but you don't need to use it. So for today's purpose, we are not going to use external power. Okay, fuel quantity and totalizer checked and reset. So again, the fuel quantity is checked and the totalizer is checked as well. Can press reset once more, but you don't necessarily have to. Okay, next up, landing gear position lights, 3 greens. Those are what we have down here. And crew awareness system appropriate. So we are checking for everything that is illuminated up here, and we make sure that it is appropriate for our current condition of flight. And as you can see, essential bus, avionics bus, generator 2, generator 1, stick pusher, and environmental control system. Yeah, those are all off, so they are appropriate for our phase of flight. And that's the before start checklist complete. Now comes a little difference between airliners and between general aviation aircraft. In the general aviation, typically the engine is started first, and only after the engine is started, you're going to start to program your radios. At this point, if you needed a startup clearance, then you would just tune your radio to get your startup clearance. But if you're on an uncontrolled airfield, you don't even need that. So that's a little difference between airline flying and general aviation flying. In the GA, we're going to start the engine, and then we're going to do all the setup of the GPSs, contrary to the airlines where you do everything before you start the engine. Okay, engine start checklist. And let me quickly talk you over the engine start before we actually do it. So when the engine start is initiated by pressing the starter button up here, we are going to see the NG rise. And when the NG is at 13%, between 12 and 20 they say on the pilot's operating handbook, but basically when it's at 13, then you are going to add fuel using the condition lever by putting it into the ground idle position. And that is going to start up your engine. Now, when the engine is starting, you can see on the ITT gauge there is that little mark up here in red. That's 1000 degrees, and you want to be sure that it doesn't exceed 1000 degrees for more than a couple of seconds. If it does, shut the engine down again and perform a dry motoring. But today I don't see that happening. And if you follow correct start procedures, it basically shouldn't happen at all. Okay, so that is your engine start procedure, so let's go over the engine start checklist now. Beacon light on. On. Prop area clear, and we can observe our prop area to be clear up there. Start switch engage. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, press the starter. We can observe our NG rising, and when it reaches 13%, so basically now, put the condition lever into the ground idle position. And now we are just monitoring, make sure the ITT doesn't rise above 1000 for more than a few seconds. As you can see, we are not even getting close today. And here we go. That is basically a good engine start. So that's as easy as it is. So then we can move to the after start checklist. Engine instruments check. Again, you're making sure everything's in the green up here, but the most important is down here, the oil pressure. You want to make sure that you've got oil pressure after your engine start is successful. The temperature doesn't matter too much, especially if the engine has been cold for a while, but the oil pressure you need immediately after the start. Okay, then we can move on. Generators on. So we've got generator number 1 and generator number 2. So external power off. It is off already. Avionics on. That's number 1 and number 2. Standby bus off. Off. Cooling and heating as required. Now, this is a bit of a thing. We've got the cabin temperature gauge down here, and it's plus 10 degrees right now. This basically matches the outside air temperature. So when that happens, we want to put on the heating. And we've got both cabin heating and a foot heating in here. Now the foot heating, well, we are gonna turn them both on because it's nice for the passengers, but the important thing over here is cabin heating. Also, we've got a temperature regulator down here, which we can put somewhere to the middle position or so. Okay, now we move on with the checklist. Next is EPS light out. Now we move back to the emergency power system, and you can see the EPS on light that previously used to illuminate when we switched it to arm, now is out. That basically indicates the emergency power system has been relieved by the normal power of the airplane, and now it's just armed but no longer on. Okay, then we move on to the ECS switch, put that in auto, and you can actually hear the air conditioning system coming on now. And the last thing, flaps 15. The flap lever is located down here. Move it to 15, and then we got a flap gauge up here, and this is coming out to the 15 position now. And that's the after start checklist complete. So now we can go ahead and do our avionics, or we can do that a little bit later in the before taxi checklist. Both are basically going to work. So for us today, we want to obey the checklist, so we are going to do the before taxi checks now. Inverter switched. So your inverter is located down here. It's on generator 1 right now. We just switched to the battery for a short moment. Observe change in the amperage. Now let's go back to generator 1. So that way we can check our inverter is actually working. Next up, we're going to do the pusher test. Now the pusher test is one of the, let's just call it a little bit more complex things, because you can easily do it wrong, and if you do it wrong, you are going to stick with the pusher master caution up there. At this point, by the way, thank you very much to the test pilots of SimWorks Studios, whom I've had a couple of great chats with and a great call with while they were actually on duty sitting in the crew area waiting for their next passengers. So thank you very much for being available on such a quick notice to help out where there was a bit of information missing from the manual at the point of this recording. So the pusher test, you want to make sure that you've got flaps 15 out, so that's what we got up here. You want to make sure the environmental control system is on, or auto, that's what we've got down here. And then you want to make sure your generators are running, so we don't have any generator cautions up here. Those are the basics to perform the test. The way we do the test is you push the pusher button on the overhead, put your throttle forward and then back real quick. Now, then you'll see the stick pusher first shake the control column, as in a normal stick shaker, and then it's going to push it forward. When that happens, we've got to press the pusher interrupt button, and luckily enough, we got an instruction right on the control column here. So pusher interrupt is that button over here, that red one. And then we want to be sure that we can actually move the control column again. And that is going to be the pusher test. And when that's executed correctly, the pusher light is going to go out. So that is how you do it. So let's go ahead and do it now. We're going to start with the pusher button up here. Now, move your throttle forward and back again. You can see that triggers the pusher. Now it's being pushed forward, it's vibrating, and now we press the red button to cut the pusher out. And now we're going to move our control column again to be sure that we can actually override the pusher when it's cut out. Okay, and that's the test. Now we can release the interrupt and we can release the pusher button. And now you can observe the pusher light is actually no longer extinguished. So, and that is our stick pusher test basically complete. Alright, from here on, next point is avionics set. So this is our point where we are going to program our avionics. So make sure that the GPSs are running up, we turn our transponder standby, also tune our squawk. In this case, well, it doesn't really matter, so let's just go 0330, some sort of a squawk, and then we can start our GPS setup. We're going to start on the flight plan page over here, and let me just show you that again. So clear that up. On the flight plan page, with the first line illuminated, we push or rotate the small button down there, and that brings us into the selection menu. So now you can either just press that button up here and then use your keyboard, your physical computer keyboard, to do entries, or you do it the realistic way and you use the large button in here to rotate through the different places. Now we can use the small buttons or the small button in order to select the letter that we want. And this is how you would do it on the real airplane. So we depart in Saint-Tropez, LF Tango Zulu, and our destination is going to be Lima Fox Kilo Charlie, Calvi. And here we go. Alright, next up we go to procedure, select departure, and now we can choose the departure that we want to follow. Now, at this point, let me just bring up the Navigraph chart app once again, because that will contain our flight plan and everything we need. Okay, so we got the Sodri 1 Golf departure, as you can see up there. So let's scroll down with a big button to find that. Here it is, Sodri 1 Golf, runway 06, load that up. And now we can go on to progress again, select arrival, and in here we can select our star straight away. And you can see that's the Sodri 2 Kilo planned, but as I said earlier, we're going to switch that around to the Sodri 2 Lima arrival. So that's this one, which is the one appropriate for the RNAV approach. Sorry, for the localizer approach. The other one is for the RNAV. And obviously, if you do find out that your star is not among this, do check that you've actually got the correct airport in there. Sometimes it just doesn't select the arrival airport. So if that happens, just mark the airport, Lima Foxtrot Kilo Charlie, hit enter, and now you can see all of a sudden we got the correct list. So Sodri to Lima is what we want to take for runway 18 landing, and we're going to load that up as well. And finally we go into procedure again, and this time we select the approach, and it's going to be the localizer approach runway 18, and we're going to fly that from Ilru, since that is where our star ends. Okay, load, be sure not to activate, so just load. Confirm that GPS guidance is for monitoring only, load approach, yes, and that's it. So now, when we go into the flight plan, and we press the small button, with the big button we can now scroll down and make sure that our entire route of flight is in there as it is supposed to be. And that's what we have right now. So that's our route basically loaded up in the GTNs. Now in the real world you would have to do a crossfill between the upper and the lower one in order to get your procedures into both. In the simulator, luckily, that is not necessary, they are both going to synchronize straight away. So next up, let's continue with our avionics setup. So we've got the Saint-Tropez VOR 16.5, and in order to tune that, we press the small button on the left side to mark our VOR. Like that, we can now select our VOR to 16.5, and we're going to do that on both radios, so nav1 and nav2. In terms of frequencies, we are going to go with a standard setup up here. Obviously, you could just tune the real-world frequencies, which we can find down here. La Mole information 118.125. So we could set that active 118.125, and then, for example, for our departure, we could use the VATSIM Honeycomb frequency 122.8, something like that. And in COM2, normally you would have the guard frequency 121.5 active, and on standby you would use your local HOTAS if there was one available. Alright, so that is our setup completed over here. Now, one more point that we need to talk about is how would we normally use our displays. Now, the GNS 530 got the largest map, so I'm going to go out of the flight plan window, and then by scrolling on the left small button, we are switching over to this page, which in my opinion is the most informative for the flight. And then on the lower one, I'm going to select the flight plan page so that we can actually see what the thing is doing in terms of the route down here. And that is the setup that I would use for my GNS. Now, next thing for us to do is to check that all the stuff in the flight plan is correct. So you could go over this, like, okay, 1500 feet, then you do a right-hand turn towards Sierra Tango Papa. That's what we've got down here. Now we can basically scroll through this. After that, we proceed towards Lerma. Then we've got manual sequence because we're going to get radar vectors at that point towards Omart, and that's what we have down there. And then we continue via Merlu to Sodri, and you can see that is where the arrival already begins. Okay, so with that, our route is now checked as well. So we can now get rid of the Navigraph charts. And we can now move on to our primary flight display. Down here we want to select the correct source, and the controls are located just down here. So by pressing the nav button you can switch between the different sources, and we want to make sure to have it onto GPS. Next up we're going to align the heading bug with our runway heading, and luckily they do seem to match pretty much, so 060 is what it is. You can match the heading bug to your present heading just by clicking the button, and by rotating it, well, you can rotate it. Alright, so one more thing for us to do over here is we can adjust the display brightness. As you can see, the primary flight display is very bright over here. So what I'm going to do is, with that brightness button down here, we can control the brightness of the displays. But do note that right now, by default, we are controlling the brightness of the navigation display. If we press the system button up here, it's a little small button that's well hidden. Like that, we can switch it around. And now, with the brightness button, we can actually control the brightness of the let's just try that again. We can control the brightness, or we should be able to control the brightness of primary flight display. Well, doesn't seem to work too well. Normally it does, but well, here we go. Okay, so it was the 1 or 2 button down there as well. Looks like it. Obviously we are staying on GPS 1. Normally that button is used to change between nav 1 or nav 2. Like, if I'm now going to a VOR and I press a 1 or 2 button, you can see I'm changing around over there. But well, as long as it works, we are not going to question it. Alright, finally we've got 2 different modes available. That's the HSI mode or the ARC mode. Personally, I prefer to fly with the HSI mode over here, because the airplane does not yet have a full map integrated, so that is something that's going to come with a future update according to the product manual. Finally, since we have a VOR tuned, let's also put on the VOR display, so pressing that button over here brings on VOR number 1. And pressing that button over here brings on VOR number 2, and obviously they're both indicating into the same direction. Okay, the weather radar at this point is inoperative, otherwise we would just switch to standby and run a weather radar test, but since currently there is no weather radar available in Microsoft Flight Simulator, that is what we've got to live with. Okay, finally we are going to set the local QNH, and be aware that we've got several altimeters, so we've got one down here, then we've got the one up here, so all of those need to be set. I'm going to make my life easy, I'll just press the B button. That's going to set all 3 altimeters. So standby, primary, and primary number 2. Okay, so that is our basic avionics setup complete. Something that I personally like to do is to take the altitude buck, rotate it to the field elevation, so that I know when we are 1,000 above field elevation. And obviously, we got to set our initial climb, 4,000 feet here in Saint-Tropez. Okay, I'm going to reset that caution. AOA de-ice is noted and appropriate for the phase of flight. And that is basically it. Last thing over here is just a bit of information. On the right hand side you can see you've got another avionics or another controller for a navigation display. That's obviously for the first officer's side. I'm just going to set it over here and I'll adjust the brightness a little bit so that we can actually dim these displays down as well, as I do like my displays to be in sync, but that's just for information, not necessary. Okay, so that the avionics are set, and we can now move ahead to the next item in the checklist, which is autopilot and trim test. Unfortunately, right now the test button of the autopilot is not simulated, so we need to skip over this item. Then we can move forward. Cabin pressure controller set, and that's what we find down here. Now, when you are flying at altitudes greater than flight level 130, you want your cabin to be pressurized. And for that, we're going to pre-select the cruise altitude on the controller. So let me just move in a little bit so that you can see it better. Here it is. So today we are going to cruise at 13,000 feet. What we want to do is we want to select those 13,000 plus 500 feet so that we got a little bit of margin there and don't run the airplane directly to the edge of the envelope. So you can see at 13,000 down here, by default the airplane can even do sea level pressure. However, we are just going to add 500 to that so that we'll get the airplane slightly pressurized in flight, and that's all we need. Also make sure that the cabin rate controller is set to the 12 o'clock position like it is right now, so that the cabin rate of climb is going to be 500 feet a minute. You can control this live in flight later on then if you want to, but today something about the 12 o'clock is going to work perfectly for a nice 500 foot a minute rate of climb in the cabin. Okay, then we can move on to transponder and flight ID set, and we've basically pre-selected this already, so the transponder is set. Okay, altitude pre-select set, and that's what we've done up here. And you also want to be sure to actually arm this so that the airplane is going to level off when you reach that point. AHRS 1 and 2 checked, so we just make sure that we get correct indications on here. And then we go on to the fuel quantity and totalizer, check that once more, verify quantity, verify fuel used, and be sure that it is balanced. Okay, finally, crew awareness system appropriate, and again, AOA de-ice, that's because the probe heat is not turned on, so everything else is off, so this is appropriate for the phase of flight. And that's the before taxi checklist complete. So next is the taxi checklist, and that one we can do while taxiing, or personally, since we are operating single pilot here in Sim, I prefer to do it when we actually reach the holding point. Alright, now for the taxi I'm gonna get rid of the my sun visor, and you can rotate it by strolling on the black part. You can also extend or retract it by moving on the red part. Like that. So let's get rid of that. Here we go. And we're gonna get rid of it on the other side as well. Alright, perfect. So now we are ready for taxi, so let's go ahead and turn the taxi light on, release the parking brake, and off we go. Runway 06 is just a right hand turn away, so it's going to be a very short taxi. Now, the PC-12 does simulate the beta range of your prop, so for that reason, when you're standing here, nothing is going to happen. Now, we'll just add a little bit of power, and you can see that's sufficient to get the plane moving. Brake check. Looking good. And then we can move out to the right hand side. Now you will notice that when I'm moving my rudder pedals here, the control column does automatically respond to it. And that is realistic. That is completely realistic. The real airplane would do the same thing. The reason behind that is that the two are interconnected. So When the control column is being moved, the pedals are going to move, and when the pedals are moved, the control column is going to move. And that's completely realistic. That's how it works in the real PC-12 as well. As you can see, just a tiny bit of power lever movement like that is sufficient to get your airplane move at an appropriate speed. And that is what we are going to do. Now it does get rather dark inside here, so let's quickly turn on some lights. And as I mentioned, these on the left here do light up the bases of your panel, and those are usually sufficient for your needs. However, you can put on the complete panel lighting as well, going down here. Panel floodlight makes everything a little bit brighter, but then you might have to adjust the brightness of the displays. Now I'm going to turn that panel floodlight back off because I'm happy with it this way. Okay, so let's go over the taxi checklist then. Flight controls, free and correct. So let's do flight control check here. Up, down, left, right. And note how the rudder is moving along when I'm moving my aileron. That's because the two are interconnected, as I mentioned. So this is correct and realistic. Flight instruments, checked and set, which they are. Flight director go around, so we find that switch down here, and pressing that is going to pull up our flight director. Then we can go at altitude pre-select, set and armed, that's 4,000 feet and armed. Heading bugs set and armed, so heading bug is set down here, but I'm not going to arm that. I'll just keep it on roll mode up here. Okay, electric trim set for takeoff. So you've got the trim indicator down here, and you basically want to make sure that that is in the green position. Do note that if you want to operate it, I've pressed the button now. This is very, very slow to respond, as you can see. But that is completely normal and realistic. Alright, then we can move ahead. Electric trim set for takeoff, yes. EGPWS test, that's what we got over here.
EGPWS system OK.
Perfect. And finally we can do a crew briefing, and with that the taxi checklist is complete. So, crew briefing. I'm going to use that as an opportunity to explain to you the profile that we're going to fly on the takeoff. So, the PC-12 got a lot of power and you can climb very, very steeply with it. However, for passenger comfort reasons, you don't typically do that. So all the real-world PC-12 pilots I talked to told me something along the lines of the following for our takeoff profile. We're going to set the takeoff power, which is technically speaking 43.3 on the torque. However, anything above 40 is acceptable because the plane accelerates so quickly, you will probably not be able to set your torque entirely precisely as an auto throttle would do in an airliner. You don't have that here. Anything from 40 is acceptable. Now, from there on, at 80 knots, we're going to rotate to a pitch of 7.5 degrees. With a positive climb, we are going to retract the landing gear and put the yaw damper on. Passing 400 feet, if our speed is greater than 100 knots, which it should be at that point, we're going to retract the flaps. Once the flaps are retracted, we are going to continue like that until we're at 1,000 feet. At 1,000 feet, we are going to set our climb power of 36.9 on the torque. And then, and this is most important, we're going to climb between 1,200 and 1,500 feet a minute. And no more. You are going to gain speed to something around 190 or 200 knots with that. And that's totally fine, because it is going to offer us a nice deck angle for the climb. So we're going to get something about between 3 and 5 degrees of a pitch. And like that, we're going to climb. Now that's going to give us a pretty high speed, but that's totally acceptable. Now, if you need to climb steeper, your best rate of climb is going to be at 130 knots. But that is going to give you a pitch of some 15 degrees, which is not very comfortable for the passengers. And for that reason, even though it gives us the best rate of climb, we aren't going to use it unless necessary, for example, for terrain. So that's the normal flight profile for the PC-12. So remember, rotate at 80, and that's rather important here, because of some internals of Microsoft Flight Simulator. If you rotate much too late, the airplane is going to behave incorrectly. So rotate at 80, positive climb, gear up, yaw damper on. The latter is rather important because the yaw damper plays a major role in this airplane. More on that in flight. So 80 knots rotate, positive climb, gear up, yaw damper on, pitch 7.5 degrees, and when passing through 1,000 feet we're going to set climb power, and we're going to assume a rate of climb between 1,200 and 1,500 feet a minute. And that's the entire takeoff profile. That's all there is to it. Alright. So with that, we are ready to go. And we can now line up on the runway, read our final items, and then we can take off. So let's do the final items checklist. Flaps 15 or 30. We're going to use 15 for the takeoff, which is the typical takeoff setting. Lights as required. So let's turn on the landing lights, the strobe lights, and the recognition lights. And down here, we are also going to switch the recognition lights into the pulse setting. You can see that confirmed on the light over there, and this is what it looks like. You can see the left and right hand lights are pulsing, and the reason we do that is because it increases our visibility and it decreases our chance of a bird strike. So that's the reason we do this. Okay, ice protection is required. Now temperature currently is 10 degrees, so we don't need anti-ice for our takeoff. However, what we always need is our probe heat, and that one we are going to turn on. Okay, you can see now the AOA light has vanished from the course as well. So, condition lever flight idle. That is a little bit hard to reach at times, but here it is, condition lever, and we'll bring that forward to the flight idle position. You can see our engine is running up. And finally we'll check the crew awareness system to be appropriate, and again, it is. So, nothing displayed right now for the takeoff. Okay, cool. So, with that, we have completed the final items checklist, and we can line up. As you can see now, with the condition lever in the flight mode, the airplane is taxiing on an idle thrust already, so just something to keep in mind as you're operating the plane. Okay, rather hard to read anything on that runway, but we shall be fine. Yeah, I can see a couple of runway markings over here, so the runway is confirmed. That's looking good, and we are ready to go. So, when we start the takeoff, we are also going to start our elapsed timer, and down here we've got our chronograph. Now, by rotating that little button left and right, you can switch between the different settings, like that's the local time, that's the GMT time, and then we've got our elapsed timer down here. And then when you press it with the left mouse button, that is basically going to start your timer. Okay, so, are you ready to go? Then, so are we. Remember, 80 knots rotate, 7.5 degrees pitch, positive climb gear up, yaw damper on. At 1000, set climb thrust 36.9 and assume a rate of climb of between 1,200 and 1,500 feet a minute. And that's it. That's all we need to do. Okay, so, transponder on alt, and with that we are good to go. Take off. I'm holding my brakes for a little bit, starting the timer, and then let's just keep holding on the brakes, but the plane is eventually going to start skidding because it's got a very strong engine. But we just want to be sure that our torque is somewhere in the region of about 40, but not in the red band. Here you can see we're skidding even though the brakes are held. So brake release, torque looking good, speed live, 80 knots rotate. Pitch 7.5, like that. Positive climb, gear up. Yaw damper on. We're just going to hold it like that. Passing through 400, speed is above 100 knots, flaps up. Maintain the pitch. And that is looking very good. Okay, now we are going to go into vertical speed mode, so we can pull that button, set our target VS of 1,500 for example, then we can engage vertical speed mode up here. Also we're going to press nav, and then we can engage the autopilot. So the autopilot is now in control of the plane. We're passing through 1,500, so we make that right hand turn on the SID. We'll now just let the autopilot fly the airplane. We're through 1,000 feet, so we're going to set our climb power of 36.9 on the torque, and if you end up a little bit below that, that's not a problem either. So 36.0, Something like that is perfectly going to work. Okay, now as you can see, 1,500 feet a minute, we're doing a pitch of about 5 degrees, and that is comfortable for the passengers. So we're just going to leave it like that. Okay then. So let's say ATC is clearing us to a higher altitude now, so we can switch this one back, push that one back in. Now we've got our target altitude here, and we can set our cruise level of 130. After takeoff checklist. Landing gear, up, yaw damper, on. You can also cross-check that on the pre-FD. YD is showing. Landing and taxi lights off, and we can do that at this point because we still got the recognition lights on. So landing and taxi lights are going off. Flap 0, cross-check up here, 0. Ice protection as required. Now you can see current outside air temperature is +7, so we should turn on some of our anti-icing. Now, as we still got a lot of rain over here, we can basically determine that there are no icing conditions here. But nonetheless, let's turn on the prop anti-ice, and we're also going to turn on the windshield anti-ice, like that. Okay, climb power set. And this is an important point in the checklist, because it is rather easy to actually mess that up. So you can see the torque is constantly decreasing as we climb to a higher altitude. That's because the pressure of the air is dropping, and therefore our torque is dropping as well. So we can increase our power a bit again to our 36.9. And we constantly have to do this through the entirety of the climb. Alright, then we got pressurizing, and we can check that down here. Now, today we just had a very short climb, so our cabin altitude is basically at its target already of, well, 300 feet, but we can verify that on the gauge. The most important thing here is that we can see the differential pressure increasing. So right now we've got 2.4 psi, and that is increasing. And in case we were climbing to a much higher level, we'd also check our cabin climb indicator showing us some 500 feet a minute, and we could adjust it as appropriate. Now, if you perform a climb at a very steep angle, so if you're using 130 knots for the climb, the airplane is going to give you like 3,500 to 4,000 feet a minute rate of climb. But while that happens, you need to increase the cabin rate of climb to like 700 to 1,000 feet a minute, because otherwise you're eventually going to exceed the maximum differential pressure, and that is going to give you a cabin altitude caution. So if for whatever reason you decide to climb at 130 knots and the highest rate of climb possible, then be very careful with your cabin pressure and adjust it as necessary. Otherwise you are eventually going to get a cabin altitude warning. Okay, and that's the after takeoff checklist then complete with the last point, engine instruments. So again, we keep monitoring over here that everything is working, our pressures are looking good, the torque is continuously adjusted. Alright, after takeoff checklist complete, and at the transition altitude we're going to set the altimeters to standard, so let's do that now. Standard set once, set twice, and on that one we got to do it manually, so set 3 times. Standard cross-check, passing flight level 7.5. Now, and at that point we compare all 3 altimeters. Alright, and that is our procedures basically completed for now. Now, as we climb to a higher altitude, the turbine temperature is continuously going to increase. You can see it over here already. If you notice, during the takeoff we were at a temperature of about 680 degrees during the initial climb, and now we're at 730 already. So as we climb higher, the ITT is going to increase. The limit is 760 degrees. However, we want to keep ourselves a little bit of a margin, so we will take 750 degrees as our target ITT for the climb. So we need to keep an eye on this, and we'll constantly have to adjust the power. At first we have to adjust it to maintain the target torque of 36.9, and once the ITT reaches 750 degrees we have to adjust the power again in order to maintain the ITT. And that is what governs your climb in the PC-12. That's how you control it. Now, in order to reduce your ITT as we gain altitude, we'll need to pull a little bit of power off. And that is completely realistic. That's what you need to do in the real plane as well. This will, however, in turn lead to your airspeed eventually decreasing, And the way we are going to do this is we're going to maintain our rate of climb between 1,200 and 1,500 feet a minute until eventually we reach 150 knots. When we reach 150 knots, we're going to turn into speed hold, and then the airplane is going to maintain that 150 knots. And that way we have a very comfortable climb for our passengers. So, passing through flight level 100, we do a quick check down here at our pressurization, make sure the airplane is pressurizing, and make sure that if we were to climb to a higher level, our cabin altitude would also be increasing, but in a realistic manner. So be sure to have an eye on those two gauges up here. Okay, cool. So that's basically that. We are now approaching the waypoint, Lerma, after which we would require a radar vector from ATC. So what we're going to do is we'll just go direct. So let's go down here. We are going to go direct to OMART. So mark OMART in the flight plan, hit the direct to button, hit enter, hit activate, and now we're flying direct to OMART. Okay, the ITT is reaching 750 now, so we can start to slowly pull a little bit of power off to keep our ITT at 750. Again, the limit is 760, so we are keeping ourselves 10 degrees of margin over here for our climb. And we're approaching 1,000 to go, so let's go vertical speed 1,000. And we simply let our airspeed increase. So that's 1,000 to go. You can see the altitude alert light has come on over here. And what we can do to make our life a bit easier is take the target bug and just put it onto the 0 position, or whatever altitude you want to currently fly at. So that's about as easy as flying a PC-12 really is. Outside temperature currently -8, so it looks like we will be cruising inside the clouds, inside the rain, so we're going to leave our ice protection systems on. And also have a look out at the wings every now and then. You can see right now there's actually a little bit of ice forming on the leading edge. So with that ice formation over there, we are going to run the de-ice boots. Click that on, and that is going to trigger the boots. And as you can see, as soon as the boots inflate, the ice is completely knocked off your wing's leading edge. So that's how it works, and that's how you're going to control that. Okay, reaching our cruising altitude of flight level 130, the ITT still at 750 is good. So now we can set our cruise power, and I'm quickly going to match our heading bug up here. So now we can run the cruise checklist, and the first point of that is cruise power set. So in order to set our cruise power, we can have a look at the appropriate table in the product manual. Now that is currently a work in progress at the moment where I'm recording this video, so for that reason let's use the table from the actual POH of the airplane. And over here we have got those tables. So basically we just go into the table and search for our altitude, so 13,000 today. Then we search for the appropriate indicated outside air temperature, and that gives us our target torque setting. Now as we can see, temperature is -9 degrees OAT, and we're at 13,000. So with that knowledge, we are now going to go into the table. We can see this one only goes to -7, so let's go up a little bit. And here we go, -9 at 13,000. 36.8 is our maximum cruise power that we can use. Alright, so with that knowledge, we can now go into here and we just check our engine gauges. As you can see, currently we're at 32.7, so technically we could increase our torque. But as we do that, you can see our ITT also increases. We want to be sure not to increase above the 760 limit. So for that reason, while the maximum is determined through the table, we want to be sure that we actually obey the ITT limit as well. So we're just going to keep it at 750 degrees. And that is basically all we need up there. Okay, so that's the first point in the cruise checklist complete. Cruise power is set. Fuel sufficient and balanced. So let's have a quick look down here. As we can see, we've got 1,000 pounds on board. We're using 500 an hour, but we only have like 20 minutes of flight time left. So we are running very well in terms of fuel, and it is balanced as well. Engine instruments checked. Again, we are just going over everything, making sure that we don't exceed any limits over here. and all of that is looking good. Cabin pressure stable and in the green. As we can see, the differential pressure is risen up to 5.5, which is just below the amber marking. So it is in the green and it is stable. And finally, cabin temperature appropriate. So let's move down here. It's 24 degrees right now. Very nice. So we're going to keep that. And that's the cruise checklist complete. Now with our cruise checklist complete, let's already start preparing for the descent. So what we're going to do is we'll run to the VNAV button over here, and we want to set our platform altitude. So let's grab our Navigraph charts once more and see what we've got for our approach. So localizer 18. Well, first we're going to check if there's any restrictions on the star, but as you can see there is no altitude restrictions on here. So now let's move to the localizer chart, and the approach starts at the Fox Lima 18 at an altitude of 3,000 feet. So let's now go to the GPS and set our target altitude to 3,000 feet MSL, and we want to reach that like 4 miles before, and now we're going to select the appropriate waypoint, Fox Lima 18. Okay, vertical speed profile is we want to dial in 1,100 feet a minute in here. The reason why I'm going to explain in a moment. So 1,100 is the target vertical speed profile. Okay, so we've just reached our cruising altitude. We have calculated our top of descent, which is rather important in here. So we now know we've got 14 minutes to fly. You can also check all the messages in here. Approaching VNAV profile, yeah, thanks, we don't care. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so like that, we are all set up now. Might also just zoom a little bit in here. Basically, handle your displays as they fit you. Alright, so we have reached our cruise. We are now nicely in the cruise at 13,000. Let's talk a little bit about determining which altitude you even want to use for your cruise. Because when you use SimBrief for your flight planning, it is going to give you rather high altitudes. And we do not necessarily want to climb to all those high levels all the time. Now, when I talked to the real-world PC-12 pilots, they told me that those guys I talked to were flying over in the United States. And they told me they usually want to fly the airplane VFR, so they stay below the flight levels. So 17.5 is a good altitude for them, even though the airplane can go up to level 300. Only on longer flights, they would go IFR, and then use the following rule to determine the cruising altitude they want to use. And that rule is quite easy. It basically is, you take your distance of the flight and divide it by 10. And that gives you your target flight level. So let's say you want to do a 200-mile flight, then you want to climb to flight level 200. If you want to do a 300-mile or longer flight, you're going to climb to flight level 300. And that is basically going to be an easy way to determine the cruising altitude you want to choose. Now, the reason why the data from SimBrief is probably not entirely accurate is because the flight profile that is being applied, and all the PC-12 pilots I talked to applied the same profile. So we can say that even though the pilot's operating handbook contains this steep climb at 130 knots or even a climb at 160 knots for a cruise climb, that gives you a bit too high of a deck angle, and that therefore gives you data which is correct per what the airplane manufacturer published, however, doesn't really match the real-world profiles being flown. So for that reason, if you are using SimBrief to plan your flights, then be sure to use it in a way that is going to allow you to adjust your vertical profile to the realistic numbers being flown. So, talking about vertical profile, that is the next thing that we can absolutely talk about. And that is our descent planning. We've now made it all the way in a cruise, and we can start setting up for our arrival, which is going to be a localizer approach. So, let's quickly talk about ILS or RNAV approaches at first though, because those approaches contain vertical guidance, while the localizer approach does not. So, for an RNAV or a GPS approach, we basically just want to be sure that the CDI needle here is in Warthog, and that the HSI is set to VOR 1 or 2, depending on which radio you are using. When that happens, you will see indications up here. You'll have the localizer indication and you'll have the glide slope indication. And that's the case on both ILS approaches, where the data comes from the ILS receiver, and RNAV approaches, where the data comes from the GNS. Now, obviously for an RNAV you want to stay in GPS mode up here and up here, but basically when you're approaching a profile, you just hit the approach button, and then the airplane is going to follow both the horizontal and the vertical profile of the approach. As easy as that. For non-precision approaches that don't have vertical guidance though, so for localizer approaches, NDB, VOR and so on, things are going to work a little bit different. The reason I've chosen that for this tutorial is flying an approach with vertical guidance is easy. You just hit the approach button, the airplane's going to fly you down. However, today we are going to take one of the not so easy approaches for the simple reason that we want to get proficient in doing those. And the PC-12 is an airplane flying into a lot of airports that don't necessarily have approaches with vertical guidance available. So that's the reason we are going to do one of those today. Now let's talk a little bit about preparation. We're going to start with preparation for our descent. So the first thing we just did when we reached our cruising altitude after setting the cruise power and running the cruise checklist is to determine our top of descent. Now, you will see in here that I've selected a vertical profile of minus 1,100 feet a minute. The actual profile we want to fly though is about 1,200 feet a minute. Now, why am I selecting things this way then? Basically, we are going to increase our speed as we start our descent. So the way this works in the PC-12, just like most turboprop airplanes, is when you start your descent, you're simply going to keep your cruise power until your speed increases to the maximum allowed speed. And when that happens, you just want to fly the barber pole basically. So at higher altitudes you will have the barber pole up here move down, and you are going to fly exactly that. And at lower altitudes you can just let the speed directly increase to the VMO up here. Now that's our speed profile. When we initiate the descent, with a vertical speed profile of 1,100 feet a minute, that GPS calculates your vertical speed required based on your present ground speed. So if we start the descent with a VS profile of 1,100, but we increase our speed in the descent, that is basically going to mean that our vertical speed required is going to increase as well. And the target we're looking for is... basically is 1,200 feet a minute, so with that speed increase taken into account, the vertical speed is going to increase, so the vertical speed required up here is going to increase to about 1,200, maybe 1,300 or 1,400. But we don't want to descend much quicker. Obviously the airplane would be able to descend at like 2,000 or 3,000 feet a minute if we just went to idle power and we just let it drop down all the way. But that again is going to give us a significant nose down moment, and we want to avoid that happening, and therefore we are going to use the profile as I just mentioned. When we initiate the descent, we need to also dial down our target cabin altitude, but that is going to be told to you in the descent checklist, and I will talk about that later on. Now, let's go ahead and check that everything we've got in the FMS is actually correct. So we're going to start checking our star, which we've got over here. So remember, both indications or both GPSs are the same. So if we just start on the lower one to cross-check our data, that is going to be totally sufficient. So we're going to start down here and mark that cursor, scroll down, so that we've got our star visible. So from Sodri, we're going to proceed on a 098 track for 19 nautical miles towards Norca. We can see 098, 18.8 miles, so roughly 19 towards Norca. And then it's going to be right to turn 177, 4 miles towards Suka. That's 177, 4 miles towards Suka. Oh man, I so hope that there will eventually be some Russian pilots flying this approach. Alright, and from Suka we're going to continue towards Iluru. Here it is. And that's again a 177 track, 11 nautical miles. That's what we have down here towards Iluru. Now, there's a holding in there. We can get rid of that. So, by clearing the hold, we are very likely also going to get a vertical profile recalculated now. So that's out. Look at that. VS required 1200. So we can start our descent straight away. Okay, so the way we do it is quite easy. We select a newly cleared altitude like that. Select the arm button and dial in the target VS. So we start at like 1300 now. Vertical speed engaged. And down we go. And altitude is armed. So now we let our speed increase. We can adjust the torque as necessary. You will see now we're at a VS required of 1300 feet a minute. Now, watch it as the speed increases. We're eventually going to be at like 1400, something the like. You can see it increasing over there. And here it comes up slowly. And obviously, eventually, as we reach our VMO, we are going to pull back our power in order to maintain VMO. And that is how the descent works. So let's quickly read the descent checklist. That only has a single item on it, cabin pressurization and rate, set. So we're going to set our cabin pressurization to the field elevation. So let's have a quick more look into the chart. And up here, field elevation is 200 feet. So we set the outer part, that one, to 200 feet, which is basically where it is. So we don't need to worry about our cabin rate descent. But if we actually had to descend the cabin, I'm just going to dial that in for demonstration purposes. Then we could use that button over here to adjust our vertical speed as needed. But today, don't really need to do that because our cabin altitude is down to our field elevation already. Alright, and that's as easy as it gets. So now we can see our speed, 225 knots. Our vertical speed required is now 1350, something like that. So if we keep doing 1300, we are going to be good. Over here you can also see the reason why we're doing it. Our pitch is like minus 4 degrees right now already, so that is rather steep for the passengers. Just look at it from the outside. You can see our nose pointing down quite a bit. So passenger comfort again is most important here, since we are flying in the charter operations, and for the charterers, the customer isn't going to come back if things mess up. Right, so now let's go ahead with our setup. You can see the GPSs have automatically tuned the localizer frequency already, and we can select that active down here. Okay, the final approach code is 177. We'll have to set that manually, or it might be set automatically when we are joining our final approach course. But prior to that, we're going to stay in GPS navigation. Also, we can dial in the minimums, which is 1,150 feet, and for that reason, I'm just going to select 150 over here, and that's our minimum indication. Okay, so that's basically the approach preparation we can do. What you do have in the airplane is a minimum selector based on your radio altitude, but if you want to use that or not, really is up to you. Personally, as long as I'm not flying in Autoland, I don't see a reason to use it, so I'm just going to stick with the barrel minimums that we've dialed in up here. Right, speed is approaching the maximum, so now we can reduce power slightly in order to keep it on the target. Do note that the torque is increasing with decreasing altitude, so that's something that you do want to keep your eyes out on. Alright, let's set our target altitude to 3000, which is going to be our platform for the localizer approach. So 3000 is set. And with that, we can also go to local QNH. So let's have a quick look into the latest weather. We can see it's now 160 at 4, 10 kilometers, few clouds in 8,800, temperature 11, QNH 1011. So let's dial in QNH of 1011. Set once, set twice, and set 3 times. Okay, passing 7,800 now. Thrust check on all the 3 altimeters. And that is looking good. Okay, with that the transition level checklist is also complete, the altimeter is set to local. So let's now talk about how we are going to execute the approach. There are 3 different techniques for approaches in the PC-12. There is a flap 15, flaps 30 and flaps 40. All can be used for your final approach. So all of them are valid options. Okay, what we are going to do is basically the following. Flaps 15 requires a final approach speed of 120 knots, and that is what you would normally use on instrument approaches when there's traffic behind you. So the PC-12 can go really slow, and in order not to disturb all those Airbuses and Boeings and whatever you might have, you basically want to keep that airspeed down, and you basically want to keep that airspeed up. And obviously for that, flaps 15 is the target setting for your approach. Then you can approach at 120 knots. So that way you fit best into the traffic flow at big airports. Flaps 30 requires an approach speed of 100 knots, and that is basically only used in case of strong crosswind conditions. With crosswinds you want to use flaps 30. The normal flap setting would be flap 40, requiring an approach speed of 90 knots, and that is going to be totally sufficient for your typical approach. Today we can basically choose because there is no traffic anywhere behind us. So what I'm going to do is I will do a flap 15 approach. The reason I'm deciding for that is that we want to have a look out on our rate of descent on the final approach. On the localizer approach we need to manage our rate of descent manually using vertical speed mode, and for that reason I want a constant but fast speed of 120 knots. Now, we are just established on the final approach course inbound, so let's match a heading bug. We're going to go to heading select, and now we'll select the nav source to the localizer, and we also want to match that heading, which is going to be 177 on the final approach. And now, since we are already receiving the localizer and are established right on the middle of it, we just click nav, and it's going to capture that localizer for us. And that is how you intercept the localizer. So a little bit of planning for the approach then. In order to fly the non-precision approach, we want to be stable on final approach speed by the time we reach our final descent point. So that's going to be over here, 9 dME. We are right now at 16 dME. So we'll level off in 3000 in a few moments, and once we're leveled, we'll let the speed decrease to reach 120 knots. And we basically want to have everything completed like a mile prior to the final approach fix, so prior to 9 dME. So we'll have it level off, and we've got about 5 miles to lose our speed, so if we just reduce our torque a little bit, that's going to be more than sufficient to get our speed down. So that's what we're going to do. So capture mode is on, also we can see it here, altitude capture. Perfect. Okay, then let's read our approach checklist. Recognition lights on, and they're on. Radius and nav aids set and identified, that's what we have. Altimeter set, they're at 1011 set. Pressurization set, so that's our field elevation down there. Inertial separator on, and that is on up there, or open I should say. Crew and approach briefing complete, and that's the approach checklist completed. Okay, once we're approaching the descent point, basically 2 miles prior to it, we'll set our altitude down to the minimums. So that's basically at 11 dME, so let's set the altitude down now, looking for 1,200 feet, which is basically the minimum that we may descend to. We're approaching our final approach fix, so I let my speed decrease now. And here's a little trick. You want to basically extend the gear and flaps 15 at the same point. So flaps 15, speed 163 knots, landing gear operation speed 177. Once you're below that, gear down, flaps 15. Approach at the top of descent, and 0.3 nautical miles prior to the FAP. So basically, now we're going to engage vertical speed. So 120 knots, the descent angle 3.1 we can see on the chart, so we're looking for 650 feet a minute. Let's use -6 down there. At 8 nautical miles, we'll cross-check 2,620 feet. So like that, we'll simply have the airplane descend down now, and we're going to follow the profile. In the meantime, we should be all set up, so we can start with a before landing checklist. That's flight controls 3 incorrect. And actually, before landing checklist, hey, that's currently not correct in the checklist document, so we'll have to skip through that for now. But basically, make sure landing gear is down, the flaps are in the target landing setting, and we can also turn on the lights. Okay, let's focus on the approach now. 7 nautical miles, we should be in 2,300 feet. And you can see we are currently like 50 feet below the profile, so let's make a small correction here in order to get back on our profile. Maintain the speed at the target, and like that we can now have ourselves fly down the approach pretty much all the way. So let's talk about landing technique then. Well, landing technique in the airplane is rather easy. You want to touch down somewhere between 60 to 70 knots, and that is rather important that you do that correctly. Now, in order to do that, the profile we're going to fly is we will make our final approach, and approximately when over the threshold, we are going to pull our power all the way to idle. That's over the threshold. That even goes for if you're using a displaced threshold, still just do it over the actual runway threshold. Power to idle, keep the nose pointed at the aiming point, and you really only want to flare just prior to main wheel touchdown. However, we got to make sure that we actually touch down on the mains, and as I mentioned, you want your speed somewhere between 60 and 70 knots. There is the last point that is worth pointing out over here, and that is with our yaw damper. So the yaw damper in this airplane is capable of trimming the rudder, and it is constantly doing that. For that reason, only turn off the yaw damper when you are at your final approach speed. So for us, at 120 knots. Only then we're going to turn off the yaw damper, because that means the rudder is now in trim for that setting. Makes sense? At least I hope so. Okay, otherwise what's going to happen is your rudder is not going to be in trim, and then you'll have to trim your rudder manually. And this is something that many of you have experienced as they have landed the plane. The moment you touch down, the plane is going to try to yaw to a side. That can be avoided by turning off the yaw damper very late. Okay, cool. So that's pretty much everything talked about that we need to talk about. So we are now fully ready for our final approach. Autopilot off. We are visual, so we are going to fly ourselves onto the puppy now. Can also remove our flight director from view. Nonetheless, we may set the missed approach altitude. Which is 3,000 feet. Okay, perfect. So now we are basically in final approach configuration. We've got everything set, we've got the power, we've got well, just about everything. So now I can put the yaw damper off. So you do need negative pitch on the final approach. That is completely normal in the PC-12. That is how it has to be flown. And since we had a faster approach speed, I'm going to idle power just now. You can really see and feel how the airplane wants to start falling down. Okay, and just prior to touchdown, we're going to flare a little bit there and put the mains down on the runway. Okay, and as you can feel, no stupid yawing or anything the likes. When the correct technique is used on the yaw damper, then your airplane is going to be very well controllable and very easy to touch down. And that's basically it. That's how you fly the PC-12. So let's now find our way to the parking. get that chart open again. You can see from that apron, we basically let it roll all the way to the end. General Aviation Apron Delta would be via taxiway Charlie, but we don't want to go there because we want to go to the GA apron over here. So we're going to vacate either Bravo or Alpha, both is going to work, and since there is just nobody behind us, I'll just let it roll all the way to Alpha and then vacate over there.
Warning, trim.
Yep, that is acceptable, and we're just going to click it away. Okay, there should be taxiway Alpha coming out at any moment. I believe I just missed it. Yes, I did. There was no taxiway sign here. I'll blame that on the scenery. So let's do 180. Could obviously just have used the turn pad, but I'll take it that way. And then we'll vacate on the next taxiway available. There was no taxiway sign that I missed, right? Over here there is one, but it seems like it's only facing into this direction. And there was no line up here as well. Okay, so taxiway Alpha, that's what we're gonna take. Alright, vacate the runway, and once we have vacated the runway, we're gonna stop the airplane. But make sure that the entire airplane is behind the line. When you're first flying a new airplane, it sometimes helps to just go to the outside view once you think that you are completely clear. Stop and just make sure that you're actually completely clear. Okay, so we can now go ahead and do the after landing checklist, which is conditionally the ground idle. And you can see that the engine is rolling back a little bit. So flap 0. Exterior lights as required, so we'll turn off the landing lights, we'll turn off the strobe lights and the recognition lights. Ice protection off. So boots off, windshield off, propeller off, probes off, just the inertial separator, that one we're going to keep open. Okay, radar standby, and that radar is on standby down there. And finally, trim set for takeoff. So basically, we are just going to trim the elevator down a little bit, but you can see how slow this really is, so it does take a bit of time. Okay, and rudder trim as well. Just put them all into the greens, and then you're good to go. And that's the after landing checklist complete. Alright, so like that, we can now pick any apron that we want to, and just park over here, and we're going to go to the left-hand side over here. We're going to put ourselves onto one of those parkings. Okay, that looks good. Sometimes to catch a tight turn, I do like to raise my point of view a little bit, because it does make it easier to see something. And I can tell you firsthand that in many smaller aircraft, you really need to do that. Okay, here we are, and then turning onto the right, onto that gate. Sometimes a little bit of differential braking does seem to help in the sim, but then again, the taxi model of Microsoft Flight Simulator is well, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I do, however, find that the nose wheel steering in any airplane, regardless how good the developer makes it, sucks. Okay, cool. So we've parked, we can set our parking brake, then we can run the shutdown checklist, which is parking brake set, environmental control system off, taxi light off, transponder VFR, and at that point we'll also switch to standby. Okay, cooling and heating off. So that's up here. The cooling is all off. The heating is now off as well. Avionics off.
Warning, avionics bus.
Generators off.
Warning, essential bus. Warning, essential bus. Generator 2.
Okay, and then we continue. The ITT has to be stable for 2 minutes, and it has been stable for 2 minutes already. Keep in mind, if you don't use power during the taxi, that time counts as well. Okay, condition lever cutoff. A little bit hard to reach. but here we go. Oh well, look at that, the Navigraph app just crashed on me up there. Okay, it doesn't matter. The power is coming off. Okay then, as soon as the propeller has stopped, which is now, we can turn off the beacon. Emergency power switch off. Control wheel lock installed, so you just click the click zone above the control column, that's gonna install the control lock. And then we can put the battery switch off. And that's the battery off. If it's the last flight of the day, we are also going to turn off the oxygen, like so, and release the parking brake. Keep in mind the trucks are in position. And that is the shutdown checklist completed. Alright, and that is your first flight on the PC-12. So let's just get rid of that. Remember how to open the door? First you gotta unlock it, and then you can open it up. So, welcome Calvi everyone. I do hope you enjoyed this flight. If you did, do let me know in the comments below. Also let me know how you liked my take on picking an approach without vertical guidance for a tutorial, like for example right now, the localizer approach. I do think it gives you a little bit of change, and anybody can press an approach button and fly down a vertical profile, right? Alright, thank you very much for watching everyone. I do hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, do let me know in the comments below and let me know your feedback about it, what I can do different or what I can do better. And I'm really looking forward to your take on this one, and I'm even further looking forward to see you fly the PC-12. Thank you very much. If you did like the video, be sure to leave a like, as it does help with the YouTube algorithms. And if you're up for more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Finally, if you really like what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Until then, see you next time, enjoy your virtual flights, and I see you all again on the next one.